Yeah, it's interesting how many qualms we're hearing from across the aisle, whether the Senate or the senators. Yes, it is. Whether it's senators or members of the House who don't think this bill is ready to go. I couldn't agree more. I think it's the most expensive bill in the history of our nation. I had a town hall this weekend. My constituents have questions about it. I've got a lot of questions about it. All the reports we're seeing come out have that it's the biggest wealth transfer in our nation's history. It's the largest effort to kick people off their health care in history. It's a sweeping assault on nutrition assistance that's going to have kids going hungry and also without health care. So I think it's a monstrosity. I don't think it's defensible either morally or economically. It's supposed to reduce the national debt, and it adds trillions to the national debt. That's because the real purpose is not debt reduction. I think it's pretty clear. The real purpose is to give tax cuts to billionaires and big business in service to this failed economic theory of trickle-down economics, which has proven over half a century to never spur the kind of economic growth to make up for the deficits that tax cuts for billionaires create. If Republicans run through these tax cuts, our economy will not magically overperform to make up the lost revenue. It just doesn't work that way. But we will see even more income inequality as the rich, the Musks, the Bezos, the Mar-a-Lago millionaires get richer and everybody else gets left behind. Some of our colleagues say they hate this bill or they don't like parts of it, but at the end of the day, they have lacked the guts to stand up for the American people, and they have voted for this travesty of a bill over and over again because the head of their party wants it. Time and again, we've seen the only Republicans willing to stand up for their constituents in the country are those who are on their way out the door. So what kind of moral compass does one need to have to think that a millionaire deserves a tax cut, but a working mom should lose her health care? As Ranking Member Moore suggested, our bills, our budgets make clear what our priorities are. And what's clear here is that Trump's Republican Party only cares about rich people and large companies. They don't care about working people. They don't care about kids. They don't care if you need Medicare or SNAP to make ends meet. This bill is an unconscionable attack on the middle class and on our poorest American neighbors. It's a 940-page testament to Republican values, and those values are grim. It's really shocking to see the supporters of this bill trying to justify taking away health care from 17 million people, kicking 5 million people off SNAP, causing the closure of hundreds of nursing homes, community health centers, and hospitals across the country, allowing mining and oil drilling on our public lands and in our public forests, raising energy costs for consumers across the country, while adding nearly $4 trillion to the national debt so that the mega rich can get mega richer. Who in their right minds thinks this is a good deal for the American people? For every millionaire that gets a tax cut, 19 people will be kicked off their health care and 6 people will lose their food assistance. I don't think these measures reflect the values of the hardworking families that I represent in Pennsylvania's 5th. And I don't think it's what most Americans want now that we have the details in writing. And that's why I think this hearing is particularly important, as this bill has been constructed over the weekend with last-minute additions, in, they're out. We all need to be reading this bill and not after taking the votes. This bill puts the government's weight entirely on the side of the wealthy and well-connected. It values caviar over kids. It values hedge funds over health care, and it values Mar-a-Lago over the middle class. The health care cuts alone in this bill are breathtaking. Medicaid, a program that ensures over 90 million Americans, including almost half of all the births in this country, is on the chopping block. The bill slashes state funding, imposing work requirements and paperwork traps, and repealing incentives to expand Medicaid altogether. And the Republican justification for these Medicaid cuts is bold. As we have heard, as anyone who's looked at it knows, federal Medicaid does not cover undocumented immigrants. But it does cover millions of children, including 99% of all foster kids, which I know is a particular concern for Rep. Moore, almost half the births in this country, and 1/3 of all kids with cancer. And that's whose health care coverage is being threatened by this bill. The work requirements are a particularly cruel hoax. They don't increase employment, they just increase the red tape. And I thought our Republican colleagues were against bureaucracy and red tape. When Arkansas tried similar work requirements, over 18,000 people lost coverage, and there was no increase in employment. This bill mandates similar complicated paperwork requirements so that a Medicaid recipient has to prove they're doing 80 hours a month of work or community engagement, even though the vast majority of folks on Medicaid are already working, in school, or caring for a family member. So even though most Medicaid recipients are working, if they forget to file a form, if they miss a verification deadline, if their employer fails to respond, or if their state agency makes a mistake, they get kicked off Medicaid. It's not that they're not eligible, it's that the paperwork gets them kicked off. It's a cruel bureaucratic paperwork trap, not a work incentive. And that's why the CBO found that these policies won't increase employment, but they will cause millions to lose their coverage. When people lose coverage, their illnesses don't disappear, their needs don't go away. They go to the emergency room, they delay care until it becomes catastrophic, they miss bills, they lose their homes to pay for treatment. Ultimately, people will die due to the loss of coverage. That's the real-world impact of this bill. But many of our Republican colleagues don't seem to get that. Mitch McConnell said people will get over it. Joni Ernst said, and I quote, "We're all going to die." And today, in this meeting, we're hearing statements that show an unfathomable callousness towards the American people who are going to lose their coverage. I had at my town hall meeting this weekend parents of kids with disabilities who overwhelmingly rely on this coverage. And the idea that they could navigate caps on coverage for their kids is simply astonishing. Plus, we're hearing from every corner that the Medicaid cuts are going to cost hundreds of nursing homes. We've got a list now of 537 nursing homes that are at risk of closing. One's in my district, 2 are adjoining. This is going to cause nursing homes, hospitals, and community health centers to close. It is really mind-boggling. We know that more than 60% of long-term care residents rely on Medicaid. But this bill cuts that funding while simultaneously eliminating staffing requirements at our long-term care facilities. So people aren't going to be able to afford the care, and the care they get isn't going to be as good as it is now. That's a recipe for disaster. We're going to see facilities shutting down and horror stories of abuse, neglect, and poor conditions. Then there's the gutting of food assistance. The bill imposes harsh new work requirements for SNAP that would kick millions off the program, including, as we've heard, families, seniors, veterans, and foster youth. It turns LIHEAP assistance into countable income. And for many of our communities, like Chairman Thompson's community, mine, LIHEAP is absolutely essential for people trying to get through the winter. It bans using internet bills in utility and allowances, and that's an especially egregious cut in the 21st century. On top of that, states are going to have to start footing part of the SNAP bill for the first time ever. This is a backdoor cut, and I know my state, as well as I assume many of the others, are not prepared to take that hit to their budgets. Like so many provisions in this bill, the SNAP provisions would shift billions of dollars in cost to the states, in addition to all the paperwork and personnel costs that this bill would add. For example, when you no longer have automatic registration for school lunches because you have untied it from SNAP, all of a sudden, all of our local school districts are going to have to re-engage with an arduous process to make sure that kids are eligible for school lunches. We had a roundtable with our local school districts a couple weeks ago, and they are terrified about this at a time when school budgets are under so much stress. All of a sudden, we're going to require them to hire dozens of new people to make sure kids can get lunches and be able to study while they're at school because their stomachs aren't growling. Multiple analyses have shown that any minimal benefit that we might get from this tax structure for lower income Americans is going to get eaten up by Trump's tariff wars. According to a new economic analysis put out yesterday by the Yale Budget Lab, this bill is actually going to reduce income for the bottom 40% of earners. A massive chunk of the middle class will actually see their incomes drop as a result of this bill. Meanwhile, people at the top 1% are going to get a $30,000 tax cut, and the top 0.01%, will get a $100,000 handout. So again, every responsible study that is looking at this is showing that we're going to see a wealth transfer from low-income Americans to the wealthiest among us. And all of this is going to be paid for with borrowed money. The bill adds nearly $4 trillion to the debt. That's not me saying it. It's Moody's, the Wall Street Journal, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. It's going to be the single largest increase to the deficit in American history. Republicans say the tax cuts will pay for themselves. It's a lie. It always has been. It was a lie in 1981, it was a lie in 2001, and it was a lie in 2017. It's still a lie today. The promise of tax cuts for the rich creating jobs and economic growth has never materialized, and we have the data of half a century to show that. What we have witnessed is a massive increase in income inequality, an acceleration of corporate concentration, stagnant wages for workers, jobs shipped overseas, and an economy that doesn't revolve around Main Street, but around shareholders, Wall Street, and CEOs. The climate provisions in this big ugly bill are no better. It represents a near total rollback of the historic investments in clean energy and environmental protection that we enacted in the Inflation Reduction Act. These cuts are going to jeopardize 1.75 million good-paying construction jobs and billions of dollars in private sector investment that is growing our economy now with solar, wind, and hydroelectric projects. We're slamming the brakes with this bill on some incredible economic growth and ceding energy dominance to China. Also, our Republican colleagues can placate their fossil fuel donors. This bill is a brazen handout to polluters. It has sweetheart deals for the oil, coal, and gas industries that read like they were written by lobbyists. It mandates lease sales in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, threatening one of the last truly pristine ecosystems on Earth. It opens 4 million acres of public land to coal mining and slashes royalty rates, a direct subsidy to the oil and gas industry. And household energy costs are going to go up as a result of this bill. We've seen 2 studies already showing that costs for energy in my state, in Pennsylvania, in New York, are likely to increase 7 to 8%. In Minnesota, they're likely to increase by 12%, and 16% increase in energy costs for Texas and South Carolina. This bill not only repeals clean energy tax credits for wind and solar, but imposes a steep excise tax on any new wind or solar project that doesn't comply with restrictions that are designed to be impossible to meet. This is a particular burden on Pennsylvania because Pennsylvania's legislature recently passed a law to help our schools convert to solar energy, using some of the credits in the Inflation Reduction Act. And this was viewed as a win-win-win-win because it was good for our construction folks, it was good for our school districts because it was lowering their costs of construction and of energy costs moving forward, and of course it was good for folks who are concerned about the environment. So it was a broadly bipartisan bill. That we now have school districts that have signed up to get the benefits of that and to use solar as they undertake needed renovations in our schools, and now that's all put on hold because of this bill. You know, we've seen the bill's going to gut tax incentives for clean vehicles and for purchasing energy-efficient appliances. For the last year, my office has been holding seminars for consumers so they know how to claim these tax credits. You know, folks, if you want an electric car under this bill, you better buy it before September because it's cutting it off that quickly. The bill also slashes funding for environmental justice initiatives that we're finally beginning to address decades of pollution and disinvestment in frontline communities. And I have many of those in my district, places that are subject to flooding and other environmental harm because they were redlined, because they haven't had the help to address those things. The bill's not just bad for the environment, it's a deliberate, coordinated attempt to reverse our progress on the climate crisis. It's going to cost us jobs, it's going to cost us economic growth, and it's going to cost us leadership in the global clean energy race. Some of us were involved in a roundtable with folks from the UK last week, and one of their business leaders said, wow, you know, Europe and the UK were really ahead of the curve when it comes to clean energy investment and innovation, but then the US passed that Inflation Reduction Act, and if you heard a giant sucking sound, it was all the investment coming out of Europe and going to the US. But they said, but now we don't know because there's too much uncertainty. It looks like you're going to roll that back, and we're probably not going to invest in the US again. So, you know, this is a multi-billion-dollar gift to the most polluting industries on the planet. It is a betrayal of future generations. And when you add the environmental harm to the harm of adding $4 trillion to the deficit, it's a betrayal of our kids. So we've also got issues of the money that's being added to the budget in this bill, especially around immigration, the dollars that are being sent to private prison contracting companies, billions of dollars. We know that they're supporting this administration in its claims that they're only going after the worst of the worst, but certainly the scenes that we're seeing on the ground are telling a completely different story. We've seen masked agents grabbing hardworking people, not hardened criminals, but people with no criminal past from their workplaces, from court appearances. The administration has ripped families apart, detaining grandmas and landscapers without notice and without any information about where they're being held, including disappearing people to countries they've never been to based on tattoos. U.S. citizens have been mistakenly arrested, and we're on track to see more deaths in ICE custody since that information started being publicly reported in 2018. You know, the reality is it's not the worst of the worst. According to a recent report from the very conservative Cato Institute, 65% of the people taken by ICE have had no convictions whatsoever. Clearly, this ICE, et cetera, is not deporting the worst of the worst. They're just trying to meet Stephen Miller's quotas, no matter who gets hurt in the process. So, you know, in addition, we have concerns that this is being done at the expense of legitimate national security and crime-fighting efforts. What we're seeing on our streets is dystopian, it's un-American, and people, including U.S. citizens, are scared of their own government, which is not something I ever thought I'd be saying, and it's really horrific to see. But Americans understand that when an immigrant is denied due process, it's a slippery slope for everyone. Because if the government doesn't have to prove whether someone's a citizen or not, whether there's a criminal or not, then they can take anyone. Without the rule of law, who's to say who's a threat to our national security or just a threat to this White House? So none of this makes people's lives better, doesn't make our country safer. We do see our colleagues trying to rush through a 940-page bill that touches everything from taxes and healthcare to border security and defense spending. No one has had the time to read all of it or review all the changes it makes. Senate released the text on, I think, early Saturday morning, made major revisions as recently as noon. And there are real consequences when you rush through bills. We saw that with the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. There were major drafting errors in the scribbled provisions in the margins of that bill that it took years to sort out. You know, when the House voted for the first time on this bill, many members of the Republican Party said they hadn't read the text and began complaining about the provisions weeks later when they finally took the time to do that job. So here we are again with a bill that is almost 1,000 pages long, new material added overnight and this morning. Aren't our colleagues, our Republican colleagues, offended that the Senate is trying to jam this bill down your throats, that you're being told, just go ahead and hold your nose and vote for it, don't worry about what's in it because the president wants it, so you just have to roll over. This is the largest spending bill in history. It costs more than the CARES Act, the American Rescue Plan, the Infrastructure Bill, and the CHIPS Act combined, and it's not paid for. Republicans are going to make the country borrow another $4 trillion, not for clean energy, not to promote health care, not to promote housing, but to pay for tax cuts. It doesn't sit well with my constituents. It shouldn't sit well with yours either. If this bill is passed and it's sent to President Trump, then our Republican colleagues will be responsible for the most expensive and wasteful bill in our nation's history. The biggest transfer of wealth, the biggest loss of health coverage that our country has ever experienced. And I think it's a tremendous failure of leadership that despite all the opposition to the bill, despite its cost, despite the major fiscal implications, that the country's being sent off a cliff. And watching this bill advance is like watching a train wreck in slow motion. It doubles down on policies we all know will leave our country worse off. It's a roadmap to a sicker, hungrier, and more unequal America. Hospitals will close, people won't get the care they need, our kids won't get the food they need, and the rich will get richer, no matter the cost to everyone else. This is a mortgage of our future. It's putting us deeper in debt. It's a legislative failure. It's a moral failure, and it should not become law. You will be shocked to know I have some questions. Ranking Member Boyle, do we have a distributional analysis from CBO for this bill?
Given the Senate changes, we do not. Even with JCT, they were only able to do distribution analysis just on the tax portion. But we do know from previous work CBO did, the totality of this bill when it left the House finds that the bottom 1/3 of Americans will actually be poorer as a result of this bill, again, when you analyze it in terms of all of its components. Bottom third of households, you're talking about households making $55,000 a year or less. They would actually be worse off as a result of this legislation, and with the bulk of the benefit going to the top 1%. Now, the Senate changes will impact somewhat that distribution analysis. All indications are it will actually get worse and not better.
I know we've seen a new budget analysis from the Yale Budget Lab, which in the pale pink is the House version of the bill and the redder one is the Senate version, and it shows that the bottom 20% of American earners are going to have a household income that is almost 3% less than it is now, while the wealthiest among us are going to be about 2% wealthier. Everybody's getting more if they start with more. And I would seek unanimous consent to enter the Yale budget analysis in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit, there's the carve-outs that were put in the bill for Alaska specifically. Can you speak to that, or is that something for Mr. Pallone?
I can't say I'm an expert on Alaska and what may or may not have been inserted at the last second. You know, I remember there was a piece of legislation 15 years ago famous for the Cornhusker kickback. Mm-hmm. So this is perhaps the Eskimo kickback. But that would be the extent of my knowledge on this provision. Although I would say it would be a pretty good reason for us to actually have the final text in front of us and have a chance to analyze all of the remarkable changes the Senate was making on the fly, minute by minute, rather than rushing the most significant piece of rushing to a vote on the most significant piece of legislation in decades.
Sure, and I mean, I think I heard at my town hall from some of my constituents who were really concerned. They were calling it the caribou kickback, but they thought it was, you know, basically unfair. And as someone who also represents Philadelphia, maybe we should go for the soft pretzel or the cheesesteak kickback. You know, what's sauce for the goose here? We've been hearing a lot of nonsense about how these tax cuts are going to pay for themselves. Can you help us better understand why that's not true?
Tax cuts have never paid for themselves, as even right-leaning economists who've testified before the Budget Committee have acknowledged. Targeted tax cuts can have some stimulative effect, but even then, never so much that they entirely make up the lost revenue. And frankly, we've had a 45-year experiment in this. If tax cuts paid for themselves, then our national debt wouldn't be $36 trillion. The bulk of the added debt since 2001 has actually come from 4 different rounds of major tax cuts. 2001, 2003, their full extension or mostly full extension about a decade later, and then the 2017 TCJA. All told, that combines for more than $10 trillion in missing revenue that would have been there had we just kept in place tax rates as they were in the 1990s under President Clinton.
Thank you. I know we've heard some concern from our Republican colleagues that we have to pass these tax cuts or else middle-class families will get slammed. I think it was a concern for Mr. Norman, although he said, we got plenty of time. That doesn't happen until the end of the year. We could pass a bill to address that. There was an interesting graph that came out from the Joint Committee on Taxation today that shows that if we did keep the tax cuts for middle-class families, that would only, and I use the word only advisedly, add $1.6 trillion to the debt. It's the keeping them for all the high-income folks that adds $3.3 trillion to the debt. And then, as someone has mentioned already, the House and Senate bills actually added more tax cuts than are in the 2017 package. So that's how we end up with $4 or more trillion in additional debt. Ranking Member Moore, we heard a little bit about the child tax credit before, and I think it's important that, I'd like it if you could address a little bit. We had an expanded child tax credit during the COVID crisis, which actually did put more money in the pockets of those who need it most. And it was shown to reduce childhood poverty in this country by something like 40%. That's not what we're talking about in this bill, is it? I know there's some changes to the child tax credit in this bill, but that doesn't reach the same people, or it's not likely to have the same effect, is it?
No, ma'am. No, Ms. Scanlon. This is not the same old child tax credit that reduced poverty among children by 40%. And indeed, it's a child tax credit that is more stingy as it left the Senate than what was produced in the House. And what it will do, it's not refundable, which means even if a married couple, both working at minimum wage, worked full-time, they probably would not meet the $30,000 threshold to get the full child tax credit. So it's not about laziness or not working. This child tax credit would inure to the benefit of wealthier people. If you're making $400,000 and your income, you get your income from dividends, you'd be eligible for the child tax credit, whereas there'll be 17 million children whose parents don't earn enough money or any money that will be left behind. So you think of a child tax credit as something that we ought to, that's an admirable thing to add to a bill when we think about the cost of children, the added expense. The group called the True Cost of Living says that when you have a child, that automatically adds $19,000 worth of costs to your family. So certainly those families at the lower end of the income spectrum who could use it will not receive it.
That it seems to be a theme with this bill, that in every instance where there's a choice to be made, the haves get more. So with the child tax credit, it's going to give more benefits to people who already have some means. With this SALT tax deduction that we've heard so much about, we're not talking about people who get the standard deduction. It's only people who have enough real estate that they're paying a lot of taxes who benefit from that. That the rich get more tax cuts and more benefits. So it just feels like it's an overriding theme throughout this. I wanted, yes.
I just want to point out the clock is working correctly. We've now gone for 30
Okay.
soliloquy, so I'd like you to please
I will
up your question.
keep moving along.
Okay?
Okay, sure. I did have another question for Reps Moore and Pallone. We've heard so much about the work requirements in this bill for Medicaid or SNAP, but particularly Medicaid, being necessary to address fraud. But I was doing a lot of research this weekend, and every time we hear about a big Medicaid fraud case, it's not the people who are the recipients of Medicaid who are the ones committing the fraud. It's the insurance companies, it's the medical providers, it's the doctors, it's the healthcare systems that are committing billions worth of fraud. How will work requirements on recipients address the bulk of Medicaid fraud?
Well, the report that came out that talked about fraud, as you said, I think it was from CMS, and it basically was talking about the insurance companies. It wasn't the people themselves, so that's obviously clear. To put it in simplest terms, I think what this paperwork does, right, is it makes you file as much as once a month to keep getting your Medicaid and say that you're working, right? But you can, and you know, the people that are actually working, it's a burden because they have to do it every month and they may miss it and then they're out, right? But I think the bigger problem is the fact that if you want an exception to that because you're disabled, because you're pregnant, or the various categories they put in, those are extremely strict, right? So let's use an example, like if you're disabled and you want to get Social Security disability, right? That's a very stringent test, right? There are a lot of people who don't meet that test, but still are disabled and can't work or can't work enough, right? Those people, the way I see the definition, they're out, right? So what they've done is they put all this paperwork and burdens on people that even if you think you can qualify an exception, you're not going to be able to. And that's what happened in Georgia. That's why in Georgia you had those 300,000 or 400,000 people that were eligible for Medicaid expansion, but only 4,500 actually qualified, not because they weren't, they actually weren't able to work. Maybe you're taking care of a relative, right? And that's a category that's in there, but how do you actually prove that, you know, because these are so stringent, that that's legitimate? I mean, this is the problem.
I agree with everything that he said, Ms. Scanlon. I would just add, we've had an example of this in our recent experience when we had an expansion of Medicaid during COVID, and people were told they had to re-up in order to be made eligible for Medicaid. 70%, 70% of the people who fell off of Medicaid were people that fell off because they didn't keep up with the paperwork. They didn't notice and they were eligible. And so I think that this bill, very cynically, is really claiming $1 trillion worth of savings just by frustrating people who may otherwise be eligible by having them on this treadmill of eligibility.
Well, it does seem like an area for reduction of regulations that maybe our colleagues could agree with us about. You know, I think any of us who've done constituent services work know, certainly Social Security, people get denied on their first round, they have to appeal. We deal with this all the time. We saw the same things that you did, Ranking Member, with respect to people who were kicked off and having to try to work with them to get them back on. So I am concerned, and the CBO seems to have affirmed that it's not that it's people who are not eligible getting kicked off, it's eligible people who won't be able to meet the requirements. But I'm more concerned about the fact that if we really want to address abuse, the billions of dollars that is going to insurance companies, to medical device manufacturers or distributors, et cetera, then it's a real problem that this president has fired the inspectors general who go after that fraud and have been very successful in bringing down, you know, major abusers, including some members of the Senate, and that there's now a proposal in the 2016 fiscal year budget process to slash funding for the General Accounting Office, which also works on cutting that kind of fraud and abuse. Ranking Member Pallone, we've been hearing about how this bill is going to increase energy costs. Can you tell us why that's happening? We just saw this new language on Saturday, and we're seeing that, everyone's constituents are going to see higher costs, 5 to 16, 17%.
Well, in general, what we find, I talked before about all of the above, which is my philosophy, right? You want to do fossil fuels, you want to have nuclear, you want to have clean energy, so be it. You can ask Chairman Guthrie, I've never been opposed to any of those, right? But the problem is if you cut off the clean energy, which is, the wind, the solar, whatever, then inevitably, and you put the burden more on fossil fuels, right? Well, right now, those things are more expensive, right? I mean, particularly coal, for example, which everything the Republicans have done in the committee in the last 6 months has been to try to encourage coal. Right now, that's more costly, right? So just in general, by cutting your clean energy arm off, which is essentially what this does, you're raising prices in general, right? In addition to that, as you mentioned, and again, part of this is, my understanding is a lot of these things were in that last, I don't know what you call it, I'll call it the manager's amendment at the end, which, I hope I know what was in it, because frankly, it's been difficult. At 12 o'clock, we got them, so I don't think they call it the manager's amendment in the Senate, but whatever they call it, right? That, from what I understand, just wiped out almost all of the credits, if you will, for any kind of clean energy, right? And they did, I think, have a tax on clean energy, which they got rid of, thank God. So we went from encouraging clean energy to actually taxing clean energy, which now the tax is gone. But I mean, all these things, and we did so many things to try to help people pay their energy bills too, a lot of that, So it's just an across-the-board increased costs, in my opinion, primarily because they've eliminated any help or any movement towards clean energy and moved in the opposite direction.
It certainly doesn't seem like something that looks towards the future. We have heard quite a bit with respect to the Medicaid cuts about senators being so concerned about the impact of those Medicaid cuts on rural hospitals that they added a fund to try to prop up rural hospitals. I don't have rural hospitals, but I have urban hospitals that are frontline hospitals and have been really challenged. We've lost several in recent years. So can you talk about the impact of these Medicaid cuts on urban frontline hospitals?
Well, first of all, this rural hospital fund is not going to be adequate, right? I mean, it's paltry, right? In terms of the actual monies available. So when you make it that so many more people who are on Medicaid lose their Medicaid, or people that are on the Affordable Care Act, lose their health insurance. Now you have these hospitals, a lot of them in rural areas, but now you're talking about urban areas, just as maybe even more dependent on Medicaid, ACA, in those cases, by making those people now uninsured, they have to absorb all the costs of the uncompensated care. And some of these hospitals, disproportionate care hospitals, safety net hospitals, are overwhelmingly dependent on, Medicaid, exchange policies, whatever, as opposed to, insurance that you get on the job. And so what do? Right? They don't have the money. Well, this is all third-party payments that they've now lost. Well, they either raise costs, which means the burden goes on people that have insurance on the job with increased premiums or increased co-pays. But more likely not. More likely, they just don't have the funding, right? Yeah. And so what states have done is many states give them direct payments, like in my state, to help some of those hospitals that could fail, right? Or they also depend on the provider tax. The Senate devastated the provider tax because the provider tax, at least in the House, was made at the current rate. You couldn't increase it because of inflation. That was bad enough. But in the Senate bill, they actually decrease the provider tax even if you already had it. So if you're charging 6% now, and they're going to make it, I don't have the actual number again, it'll go down to 5, it'll go down to 4, it'll go down to 3, to the point where it doesn't even exist anymore. And even though you say, well, okay, you don't have to pay the tax, the bottom line is the way that formula distributed, as you reduce the provider tax, they get less money in the hospital's back. And that's what's devastating. But any kind of safety net hospital, whether it's rural or urban.
Ranking Member Craig, I had a couple questions for you. Yeah. I'm finishing with the last one, yes. Understood, understood. I'm really concerned about the impact of this on our schools, especially coming as it did after the administration impounded funding for the local food purchase programs. Can you talk about the impact on both schools, kids who may be hungry, and our farmers who are now not getting the payments they were expecting?
Yeah, it's going to be devastating on top of the administration and DOGE pushing back on some of the appropriated funding for those farm-to-school programs across the country. This is an added layer because the truth is that most people who rely on SNAP as a supplemental way of putting food on the table are folks who are already working and folks with children. And so our children are going to be hungrier, and as we know, the impact on learning when kids are hungry is very substantial. You also asked a few minutes ago about the contours of the agreement that came back from the Senate. We're all still learning that framework, but as it relates to the cost shift to states, my understanding is because the carve-out that was attempted for the state of Alaska could not pass muster with the Senate parliamentarian, they had to go back to the drawing board. And I think about just how ridiculous the policy sounds of now we're going to let DC, Florida, Georgia, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, and Oregon, including Alaska, because one state didn't pass muster, we're going to let them all get 2 bites at the apple of delaying implementation of the cost shift because they are the states with the highest error rates in our country. If I were on the other side of the aisle and this came back to me from my Republican colleagues in the Senate, I'd be calling every single one of them saying, what the hell are you thinking?
Well, I think I may have to renew my request with Ranking Member Boyle that we go for the cheesesteak carve-out, because clearly the policies just aren't passing muster here. So appreciate all of your testimony, and I will yield back.